On September 17, 2003, a man boarded a luxury cruise ship in the Mediterranean expecting a vacation, and 72 hours later, he woke up in the cell in Tel Aviv, having never set foot on land. His name was Hassan Darwish, and he was a senior Hezbollah operations commander, responsible for coordinating weapons shipments from Iran to Lebanon through a network of smugglers and middlemen that spanned 3 continents. The ship he boarded was the Mediterranean Star, a vessel carrying 847 passengers, and not one of them knew that the entire cruise had been designed, funded, and orchestrated by Israeli intelligence for the sole purpose of capturing this one man. This is the story of how Mossad turned a working cruise ship into a floating prison, how they convinced a terrorist to walk voluntarily into their trap, and how they pulled off one of the most elaborate abductions in the history of modern intelligence operations. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly how they did it, why they chose this method, and what happened to everyone involved. Hassan Darwish was not a household name in 2003, but within the intelligence communities of Israel, the United States, and several European nations, he was considered a high-value target. Born in 1964 in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, Darwish had joined Hezbollah in the early 1980s during the Lebanese Civil War, working his way up through the organization's military wing over 2 decades. By 2003, he held a position that made him extraordinarily valuable to Hezbollah and extraordinarily dangerous to Israel. He was the primary coordinator for weapons procurement and logistics, responsible for managing the flow of rockets, missiles, explosives, and small arms from suppliers in Iran and Syria into Lebanon. This wasn't a job that involved frontline combat or public speeches. Darwish operated in the shadows, traveling frequently between Beirut, Damascus, and Tehran, meeting with arms dealers, negotiating prices and delivery schedules, arranging transportation through routes that avoided detection by Israeli and American intelligence. He was methodical, cautious, and according to Mossad files that would later be partially declassified, remarkably good at his job. Israeli intelligence had been tracking Darwish since 1998, monitoring his communications when possible, documenting his travel patterns, building a comprehensive profile of his activities and associates. They knew he was responsible for facilitating shipments that had resulted in attacks on Israeli positions in southern Lebanon. They knew he had connections to Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers who supplied Hezbollah with increasingly sophisticated weaponry. They knew that capturing or eliminating him would significantly disrupt Hezbollah's supply chain, at least temporarily. But there was a problem.
Darwish rarely left Lebanon, and when he did, it was always to Syria or Iran, countries where Israeli intelligence operations were extremely difficult and risky. He never traveled to Europe, never visited locations where Mossad could easily operate. He was careful about his security, varied his routes, used multiple phones, and maintained the kind of operational discipline that kept him alive in a business where carelessness meant death. Mossad had considered multiple approaches to dealing with Darwish. Targeted assassination was always an option, but killing him in Beirut would be difficult given his security measures and the risk of civilian casualties. Capturing him in Lebanon and extracting him to Israel was theoretically possible, but would require a military operation that could escalate into a broader conflict. The Israelis needed a way to get Darwish out of Lebanon voluntarily, into a location where they could control the environment completely, where they could take him into custody without witnesses, without international complications, and without triggering a diplomatic crisis or military response from Hezbollah. The idea originated in early 2002 during a planning session at Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. The specific individual who first suggested it has never been publicly identified, but according to accounts from former Israeli intelligence officers who spoke on background to journalists years later, the proposal was initially dismissed as too elaborate, too expensive, and too risky. The basic concept was this: create a scenario that would convince Hassan Darwish to leave Lebanon voluntarily and travel to a location of Mossad's choosing, where he could be captured with minimal risk of detection or interference. The scenario they eventually developed centered on Darwish's one known weakness, which wasn't really a weakness in the traditional sense, but rather a trait that made him human. He had a mistress. Her name was Rima Khalil, and she lived in Damascus. She was 31 years old in 2003, worked as a translator for a Syrian government ministry, and had been in a relationship with Darwish for approximately 4 years. Israeli intelligence had identified this relationship through surveillance and signal intelligence in 2001, and they had been monitoring it carefully ever since, looking for any leverage it might provide. Darwish was married with 3 children in Beirut, but he spent several days each month in Damascus, officially for meetings with Syrian contacts, but also to see Rima. The relationship was conducted with reasonable discretion, not because Darwish was particularly concerned about his wife finding out, but because any personal relationship could be exploited by intelligence services, and he knew that. Rima herself was not political. According to the intelligence Mossad gathered on her, she had no involvement with Hezbollah or any militant organizations.
She worked her government job, maintained an apartment in the Mossad district of Damascus, and saw Darwish when he was in town. She knew what he did for a living. She knew he was involved in weapons procurement for Hezbollah. But she wasn't part of that world. She was simply a woman who had fallen in love with a man whose profession happened to be facilitating terrorism. The plan that Mossad developed over the course of 2002 was to use Rima as the bait, not by recruiting her as an agent, which would be difficult and risky, but by creating circumstances that would lead both Rima and Darwish to make specific decisions. The operation required creating a fictional company, establishing a credible business presence in Syria, approaching Rima with a job offer that seemed legitimate and attractive, and then engineering a situation where Darwish would accompany her on a trip that would place him in Mossad's hands. The fictional company was called Mediterranean Business Solutions, registered in Cyprus in March 2002 as an import-export firm specializing in commercial goods and business consulting throughout the Middle East. The company had a functional office in Nicosia, employed several people who were entirely unaware that their employer was actually a front for Israeli intelligence, and maintained all the appearances of a legitimate business operation. The office was real, the business cards were real, the website was professional and detailed, and the company even conducted actual business transactions to establish credibility. In June 2002, Mediterranean Business Solutions began the process of expanding into Syria, opening a liaison office in Damascus and hiring local staff to facilitate business relationships with Syrian companies. This was entirely plausible. Cyprus-based companies frequently operated in Syria, and the Syrian government was at that time encouraging foreign business investment, at least in certain sectors. Among the positions the company advertised in Damascus was a senior translator in business liaison, someone fluent in Arabic, English, and French who could facilitate communications between the Cypriot headquarters and Syrian clients. The position offered a salary significantly higher than what most Syrian government employees earned, along with travel opportunities and career advancement potential. Rima Khalil applied for the position in August 2002. According to the documentation that survived from the operation, she was one of 47 applicants, and her qualifications were genuinely strong. She was fluent in 3 languages, had years of experience in translation and liaison work, and came with solid references from her government ministry position. The fact that Mossad had designed the job posting specifically to appeal to someone with exactly her qualifications and experience was something she had no way of knowing. She was hired in September 2002 and began working for Mediterranean Business Solutions a month later. For the next several months, she performed exactly the job she'd been hired to do, translating documents, facilitating meetings between Cypriot business representatives and Syrian companies, and generally proving herself to be a competent and reliable employee. The company treated her well, paid her promptly, and gave her no reason to suspect anything unusual. During this period, Mossad agents operating under business cover in Damascus observed her carefully, noting her work habits, her personality, her relationship with Darwish, and any details that might be relevant to the next phase of the operation. They confirmed that Darwish visited Damascus regularly, that he stayed at Rima's apartment when he was in town, and that the relationship appeared stable and ongoing. They also confirmed something that would prove crucial to the operation's success. Rima occasionally mentioned to colleagues at work that she wished she could travel more, that she'd never been outside Syria except for one brief trip to Lebanon, and that she found the travel opportunities promised in her job description appealing. In March 2003, Mediterranean Business Solutions began planning what they described to their Damascus staff as a regional business development initiative. The company would be hosting a luxury cruise in the eastern Mediterranean, departing from Limassol, Cyprus in mid-September, designed to bring together business professionals, potential clients, and company employees from across the region. The cruise would visit several ports, include business seminars and networking events, and serve as both a team-building exercise for employees and a marketing opportunity for attracting new clients. Rima was told in June 2003 that she'd been selected as one of 5 Damascus-based employees who would be invited to attend the cruise, recognition of her excellent work performance over the past 9 months. The invitation included round-trip airfare from Damascus to Larnaca, all cruise expenses covered, and 3 days of paid time away from the office. The only requirement was that she needed to obtain the necessary travel documents and confirm her attendance by the end of July. Rima was excited about the opportunity. According to surveillance reports from the period, she immediately told Darwish about the invitation during his next visit to Damascus in late June. His initial reaction was cautious. He asked detailed questions about the company, about who else would be attending, about the security arrangements, about why the company was organizing such an expensive event. Rima explained what she knew.
The cruise was part of a broader business development strategy. Several dozen people would be attending, mostly employees from the company's various offices, plus potential clients from Cyprus, Greece, and other Mediterranean countries. The company had chartered an entire cruise ship to ensure privacy and security for business discussions.
Everything was being handled professionally and transparently. Darwish remained skeptical, but according to the intelligence Mossad gathered through electronic surveillance of Rima's apartment, he didn't explicitly forbid her from going. Over the following weeks, Rima continued preparing for the trip, obtaining a passport, arranging time off from her government job, and discussing the details with colleagues at Mediterranean Business Solutions. In early August, approximately 6 weeks before the scheduled cruise, Rima approached her supervisor at Mediterranean Business Solutions with a question. Would it be possible, she asked, to bring a guest on the cruise? She understood that the invitation was for employees and clients, but she had a friend who was interested in business opportunities in Cyprus and who might be a valuable contact for the company. She was willing to pay for her guests' expenses if necessary. The supervisor, who was actually a Mossad officer operating under deep cover, expressed interest in this possibility. He asked about the guest's background and business interests. Rima explained that her friend, whom she referred to only as Hassan, was involved in logistics and import-export operations based in Beirut, that he had extensive business connections throughout the region, and that he might be interested in partnering with Mediterranean Business Solutions on various ventures. The supervisor suggested that if Hassan was seriously interested in exploring business opportunities with the company, the cruise could be an excellent venue for initial discussions. He offered to extend a complimentary invitation to Hassan, covering all expenses, as a gesture of goodwill and potential future partnership. The only requirement would be that Hassan provide basic information for travel documentation and security purposes. Rima was delighted by this response and immediately contacted Darwish to relay the offer. According to surveillance of their phone conversation, Darwish's reaction was again cautious. He asked why the company would offer such generosity to someone they'd never met. Rima explained that the company was actively seeking business partners in Lebanon and that the supervisor had seemed genuinely interested when she described Hassan's import-export experience. Darwish said he would think about it. What happened next, according to later analysis by intelligence officials, was a calculation on Darwish's part that reflected both his professional paranoia and his personal desire to spend time with Rima in an environment that was completely separate from his usual operational context. He knew that accepting such an invitation carried risks. Anytime he left Lebanon, anytime he traveled to an unfamiliar location, he was potentially exposing himself to intelligence services that wanted him dead or captured. But the opportunity also had potential benefits.
If Mediterranean Business Solutions was legitimate, establishing a business relationship with a Cyprus-based company could provide useful cover for some of Hezbollah's logistics operations. Cyprus was a hub for shipping and commerce throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and having access to a legitimate business infrastructure there could facilitate moving materials and funds in ways that were less likely to attract scrutiny. Darwish spent several weeks in August conducting his own research into Mediterranean Business Solutions. He had associates check the company's registration in Cyprus, verify its business activities, confirm that it had an actual office and employees. Everything checked out because Mossad had spent a year and significant resources ensuring that it would. The company was real. It conducted real business. It had legitimate clients and operations. The only thing false about it was that its true owners and ultimate purpose had nothing to do with import-export commerce. By late August 2003, Darwish made his decision. He would accept the invitation and accompany Rima on the cruise. He rationalized it as an opportunity to explore potential business connections while taking a brief break from his normal routine. He told Rima he would attend, provided the necessary documentation, and confirmed his participation. Mossad now had exactly what they needed. Hassan Darwish had agreed to board a cruise ship in international waters where they could control every aspect of the environment. Before we continue with what happened next, I want to ask you something. Write in the comments what country you're watching this from. I'm curious to know where our viewers are located around the world. The Mediterranean Star was a legitimate cruise ship operated by a Greek shipping company that specialized in Mediterranean tourism. The vessel was 186 meters long, could accommodate up to 1,200 passengers, and had been in service since 1998, conducting regular cruises throughout the eastern Mediterranean. In July 2003, the ship's operating company received an unusual charter request. A Cyprus-based business consortium wanted to charter the entire vessel for a private corporate event in mid-September, a 3-day cruise departing from Limassol, Cyprus, with stops planned at 2 ports before returning to Limassol. The charter price offered was substantially above the normal rate, enough to make canceling regular bookings and dedicating the ship to this private charter economically attractive. The shipping company accepted the charter.
What they didn't know was that the Cyprus-based business consortium that had chartered their ship was a front for Mossad, and that the private corporate event they were facilitating was actually an intelligence operation that would result in the abduction of a Hezbollah commander in international waters. Mossad's operational plan for the cruise was extraordinarily detailed.
They needed to ensure that the ship carried enough legitimate passengers to maintain the appearance of a real corporate event, that none of those passengers suspected anything unusual, that the crew remained unaware of the operation's true purpose, and that when the moment came to take Darwish into custody, it could be done quickly and quietly without alerting anyone else on board. To achieve this, Mossad recruited approximately 200 people to serve as passengers on the cruise. Some of these were Mossad officers and military intelligence that play active roles in the operation. Others were Israeli civilians who had agreed to participate without knowing the operation's specific purpose, told only that they were helping with a classified intelligence matter that required them to act as ordinary tourists on a cruise. A third group consisted of non-Israeli nationals, primarily Cypriots and Greeks, who were entirely unaware that they were participating in an intelligence operation at all. These individuals had been recruited through the legitimate business operations of Mediterranean Business Solutions and its various subsidiary and partner companies, invited to attend a corporate networking cruise as genuine guests. The ship's crew, approximately 180 people, including officers, engineers, service staff, and entertainment personnel, were not informed about the operation. They believed they were working a standard private charter, and Mossad wanted to keep it that way. The fewer people who knew the truth, the lower the risk of leaks or complications. The cruise was scheduled to depart from Limassol on September 17, 2003 at 6 p.m. The itinerary included an overnight sail to the Greek island of Rhodes, a full day docked at Rhodes allowing passengers to go ashore, then an overnight sail to Crete, several hours docked at Heraklion allowing more shore time, and finally an overnight return to Limassol arriving on the morning of September 20th. Hassan Darwish and Rima Khalil flew from Damascus to Larnaca, Cyprus on the afternoon of September 16th. They stayed overnight at a hotel in Larnaca, then traveled by bus the next morning to Limassol, where they boarded the Mediterranean Star along with the other passengers. According to the detailed timeline that Mossad compiled of the operation, Darwish appeared relaxed when boarding the ship. He was dressed casually in khaki pants and a polo shirt, carried a small travel bag, and showed no signs of suspicion or concern. Rima was excited, talking animatedly with other Mediterranean Business Solutions employees who were also boarding, pointing out features of the ship as they walked up the gangway. Darwish and Rima were assigned to cabin 4072 on the fourth deck, a standard interior cabin with 2 beds, a small bathroom, and basic amenities. The cabin assignment had been carefully chosen by Mossad planners.
It was located in a section of the ship that would be easy to isolate and control when the time came to make the arrest. The ship departed Limassol on schedule at 6 p.m., sailing east into the Mediterranean as the sun set over Cyprus. That first evening, passengers attended a welcome reception in the ship's main ballroom, where representatives from Mediterranean Business Solutions gave speeches about the company's vision and goals, introduced various employees from different offices, and outlined the schedule for the next 3 days. Business seminars were planned for the following morning, networking sessions in the afternoon, and various entertainment options throughout. Darwish attended the reception with Rima, accepted a glass of wine from a server, and spent most of the event standing near the back of the room observing rather than mingling. Several Mossad agents operating as passengers made casual contact with him during the reception, introducing themselves as fellow business people interested in logistics and import-export operations, engaging him in brief conversations that served both to make him feel included and to assess his demeanor and level of alertness. All reports indicated that Darwish seemed comfortable and unsuspecting. The plan was to wait until the second night of the cruise, after the ship departed Rhodes and was well into international waters en route to Crete, before making the arrest. This timing was deliberate. It gave Darwish time to settle into the routine of the cruise, to let his guard down, to feel secure in the environment. It also ensured that when the arrest happened, the ship would be far from any coastline, giving Mossad complete control over the situation, with no possibility of interference from local authorities or outside parties. On the morning of September 18th, the Mediterranean Star docked at Rhodes. Most passengers, including Rima, went ashore to explore the island, visit historical sites, and enjoy the day. Darwish initially stayed on the ship, telling Rima he wanted to rest and catch up on some work. According to surveillance by Mossad agents remaining on board, Darwish spent several hours in his cabin, then walked around the ship's deck, visited the ship's business center where he checked email using one of the public computers, and generally behaved like someone taking advantage of a quiet morning to handle personal matters. In the afternoon, he went ashore and met Rima at a cafe near the port, and they spent several hours walking through the old city of Rhodes before returning to the ship that evening.
The ship departed Rhodes at 8 p.m. as scheduled, beginning the overnight sail to Crete. Passengers gathered for dinner in the ship's dining rooms, attended a live music performance in the theater, and gradually retired to their cabins as the night progressed. Darwish and Rima had dinner together, attended the music performance, then returned to their cabin around 11 p.m.
At approximately 2:30 in the morning on September 19th, the operation began. 4 Mossad operatives approached cabin 4072. They were dressed in dark clothing, carried suppressed pistols, and moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed this moment dozens of times. 2 operatives positioned themselves outside the cabin door, while the other 2 used a master key obtained from the ship's security office earlier that evening to unlock and open the door. The cabin's interior was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the ship's running lights through the small window. Darwish and Rima were both asleep. One operative moved immediately to Darwish's bed, while another controlled Rima. The operative who reached Darwish pressed a suppressed pistol against his temple and spoke quietly in Arabic, telling him not to move, not to make a sound, to remain absolutely still. Darwish woke instantly, and according to the operational report filed later, his first instinct was to resist. He tried to sit up, tried to reach for the operative's weapon, but the operative was prepared for this. He pressed the weapon harder against Darwish's head and repeated the command to stay still, while a second operative moved to assist, pinning Darwish's arms and producing plastic restraints. Rima woke to the sound of struggle and began to scream, but the operative controlling her immediately covered her mouth with his hand and spoke to her in Arabic, telling her that if she remained quiet and cooperative, she would not be harmed. The entire sequence took less than 30 seconds. Darwish was restrained with plastic zip ties on his wrists and ankles, a cloth hood was placed over his head, and he was lifted from the bed. Rima continued to struggle and cry, demanding to know who these people were and what they were doing. The operative controlling her explained in calm, measured tones that her friend Hassan was being detained for crimes against the state of Israel, that she was not in danger, that she should remain in the cabin and not attempt to leave or alert anyone, and that everything would be explained to her later. The operatives carried Darwish out of the cabin and down the corridor toward a stairwell that led to the lower decks. The entire sequence of entering the cabin, restraining Darwish, and removing him took approximately 2 minutes. Rima was left in the cabin with one operative remaining outside the door to ensure she didn't attempt to raise an alarm. Darwish was taken to a section of the ship's cargo hold that had been prepared in advance as a temporary detention cell. The space was approximately 10 feet by 10 feet, secured with a reinforced door, equipped with basic amenities including water, a bucket for waste, and a mattress on the floor. The hood was removed from Darwish's head, and he found himself facing 3 men, all of whom spoke to him in Arabic.
They informed him that he was now in the custody of Israeli intelligence, that he was being detained for his role in facilitating terrorism and weapons smuggling for Hezbollah, that he would be transported to Israel for interrogation and prosecution, and that any resistance or attempts to escape would be futile. Darwish's response, according to the operational report, was defiant. He demanded to know under what legal authority they were detaining him, pointed out that they were in international waters and that this constituted kidnapping under international law, and stated that he would not cooperate with any interrogation. The Mossad operatives informed him that legal considerations were not his concern at this point, that he should focus on his own well-being and safety, and that they would discuss the situation in more detail once they reached Israel. For the next 36 hours, while the Mediterranean Star continued its cruise as scheduled, Hassan Darwish remained confined in the cargo hold detention cell. 2 guards were posted outside the door at all times. He was provided with food and water, allowed to use the bathroom facilities under supervision, but otherwise kept isolated and secure. Meanwhile, the cruise continued normally for the other passengers. The ship docked at Heraklion, Crete on the morning of September 19th, and most passengers went ashore to explore the island, completely unaware that a Hezbollah commander was being held captive several decks below them. Rima Khalil remained in her cabin for most of that day, shocked and confused about what had happened. She was visited by a Mossad officer who explained to her, as gently as possible under the circumstances, that Hassan Darwish was a terrorist who had been responsible for facilitating attacks that killed Israeli citizens, that her employment with Mediterranean Business Solutions had been part of an operation to capture him, and that she herself was not under suspicion or in any danger. The officer told Rima that when the cruise ended and the ship returned to Limassol, she would be free to leave and return to Damascus, that no charges would be filed against her, and that she should consider carefully whether she wanted to continue any association with Hezbollah or individuals connected to that organization. Rima's response was a mixture of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. She had been manipulated,
used as bait to lure someone she cared about into a trap. The job she'd thought was legitimate had been a fiction. The company she'd worked for had been a front for intelligence operations. Everything had been a lie designed to exploit her relationship with Darwish. The Mossad officer acknowledged her feelings, but was clear that she was fortunate not to be facing charges herself as an accessory to terrorism. He advised her to cooperate fully, to say nothing about what had happened to anyone, and consider herself lucky to be walking away from this situation with her freedom intact.
The Mediterranean Star returned to Limassol on the morning of September 20th as scheduled. Passengers disembarked, thanking the crew for a wonderful cruise, exchanging contact information, and generally behaving as people do at the end of any corporate retreat or vacation. Rima Khalil was escorted off the ship by 2 Mossad agents, who ensured she boarded a flight back to Damascus that afternoon. She was warned again that discussing what had happened would have serious consequences, both legal and personal. Hassan Darwish remained on the ship until after all other passengers had departed. Then, under cover of darkness that evening, he was transferred from the Mediterranean Star to a small Israeli naval vessel that had been positioned offshore. The transfer was conducted quietly and efficiently, and by midnight on September 20th, Darwish was on Israeli soil, transported to a secure facility where his interrogation would begin. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It helps us continue bringing you these detailed historical accounts. The interrogation of Hassan Darwish lasted for several weeks at a facility operated by Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, in coordination with military intelligence officers. The goal was to extract information about Hezbollah's weapons procurement networks, about Iranian supply chains, about specific individuals involved in facilitating attacks against Israel, and about future operations that might be in planning stages. According to declassified portions of the interrogation reports, Darwish initially refused to cooperate, maintaining that his detention was illegal under international law and that he had no obligation to provide information to his captors. He pointed out, correctly, that he had been abducted in international waters without any legal process, that Israel had no jurisdiction over him, and that his detention constituted a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. Israeli interrogators acknowledged these legal arguments, but made clear that legal considerations would not result in his release. He was in Israeli custody, he would remain in Israeli custody, and his cooperation could only improve his situation, not worsen it. Over the course of several weeks, through a combination of psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, isolation, and the gradual realization that his situation was not going to change, Darwish began to provide information. He never fully cooperated, never provided everything his interrogators wanted, but he gave them enough to confirm intelligence they already possessed and to fill in gaps in their understanding of how Hezbollah's logistics networks functioned. He confirmed names of Iranian contacts who supplied weapons, he described routes used to transport materials from Syria into Lebanon, he provided details about how payments were structured and laundered through various banking systems.
He explained how Hezbollah compartmentalized its operations to protect against exactly this kind of intelligence compromise. The information was valuable, though not as comprehensive as Israeli intelligence had hoped. Darwish had been well trained in resistance to interrogation, and he understood that providing too much information would endanger people he worked with and potentially expose operations that were still ongoing. He gave his interrogators enough to demonstrate cooperation without betraying his organization completely. In November 2003, approximately 2 months after his capture, Hassan Darwish was formally charged with terrorism-related offenses under Israeli law. The charges included facilitation of terrorist attacks, weapons trafficking, membership in a terrorist organization, and conspiracy to commit murder. The legal basis for the charges was controversial. Defense attorneys who were eventually assigned to represent Darwish argued that Israel had no jurisdiction because the alleged crimes occurred outside Israeli territory and because Darwish had been illegally abducted in international waters. Prosecutors countered that Israel had the right under international law to prosecute individuals who facilitated attacks against Israeli citizens, regardless of where those individuals were captured or where the alleged crimes occurred. The trial was conducted in a secure courtroom with limited public access. Much of the evidence was classified, presented to the judges in closed sessions that excluded even Darwish's defense attorneys. This practice, while legal under Israeli emergency regulations, made it virtually impossible to mount an effective defense. In March 2004, Hassan Darwish was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 25 years in an Israeli prison. He was transferred to a high-security facility where he remains incarcerated as of December 2025, having served more than 21 years of his sentence. The international response to Darwish's capture was muted and complicated. Lebanon formally protested the abduction, calling it a violation of international law and demanding Darwish's immediate release.
Hezbollah issued statements condemning the operation and threatening retaliation against Israel. Iran similarly condemned the capture and called for international action. But practically speaking, there was little that any of these parties could do. Darwish was in Israeli custody, and Israel had no intention of releasing him. The United Nations received complaints from Lebanese and Iranian representatives, but no formal action was taken. Some international legal scholars argued that the operation constituted illegal abduction and violated maritime law, while others pointed to precedents like Israel's capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960 as examples of extralegal actions that the international community had ultimately accepted.
The broader intelligence community's reaction was one of professional respect mixed with concern about setting precedents. The operation had been extraordinarily ambitious, requiring more than a year of planning, significant financial resources, the creation of an entire fictional business infrastructure, and careful coordination of dozens of operatives across multiple countries. The fact that it had succeeded without detection until the moment of arrest was impressive, but it also raised questions about the limits of acceptable behavior by intelligence services in pursuing their objectives. Rima Khalil returned to Damascus in late September 2003, resigned from her position at the Syrian government ministry, and largely withdrew from public life. According to follow-up intelligence reports, she struggled significantly with guilt and trauma related to her unwitting role in Darwish's capture. She had genuinely cared for him, had believed she was helping him by facilitating the business opportunity that turned out to be a trap, and now lived with the knowledge that her trust had been exploited by Israeli intelligence. She never spoke publicly about what happened, honoring the warning she'd been given about the consequences of disclosure. Friends and family who knew about her relationship with Darwish were told that he had simply disappeared, that she didn't know what had happened to him, and that she preferred not to discuss it. The Mediterranean Star continued operating as a cruise ship for several more years after the operation, its crew never knowing that their vessel had been used for an intelligence operation that resulted in the capture of a high-value terrorist target. The Greek shipping company that operated the vessel was never informed about the true nature of the charter they'd fulfilled in September 2003. As far as they knew, they had simply hosted a successful corporate event for a Cyprus-based business consortium. Mediterranean Business Solutions was gradually dissolved over the course of 2004 and 2005. The company had served its purpose, and maintaining the fiction was no longer necessary once Darwish was in custody. Employees who had worked for the company without knowing its true nature found other jobs, most of them never learning that their employer had been a Mossad front operation. The operation itself remained classified for several years after 2003. Details began to emerge gradually through careful reporting by Israeli journalists and through limited disclosures by former intelligence officials who spoke anonymously about operations they'd participated in or had knowledge of. By the early 2010s, enough information had been reported that the broad outlines of the story were publicly known, though many specific details remain classified to this day. The operational codename for the mission was never publicly disclosed, and the identities of most of the Mossad operatives involved remain protected.
What has been confirmed through multiple sources is the basic structure of the operation, the use of a cruise ship as the capture location, the elaborate business front created to lure the target, and the successful detention and prosecution of Hassan Darwish. The operation has been studied extensively within intelligence communities as an example of creative operational planning and complex target development. Training programs for intelligence officers in multiple countries have analyzed the Darwish operation as a case study in how to conduct operations that require extensive preparation, coordination across multiple operational elements, and maintenance of operational security over extended periods. The key lessons identified include the importance of creating genuinely convincing cover structures rather than superficial legends, the value of exploiting personal relationships as operational levers, and the necessity of controlling the operational environment completely when executing high-risk captures. Critics of the operation have focused on the ethical and legal questions it raised. The use of Rima Khalil, an innocent civilian who had no involvement in terrorism, as unwitting bait has been particularly controversial. While intelligence operations frequently involve deception and manipulation of individuals, using someone's emotional relationship as the lever for a trap raises questions about the moral boundaries of intelligence work. The fact that Rima suffered significant psychological trauma as a result of being manipulated also highlights the human cost of such operations beyond just the primary target. The legal questions surrounding the operation remain unresolved in international law. The abduction of individuals in international waters by state intelligence services occupies a gray area where practical realities often override legal principles. Israel has never acknowledged that the operation violated international law, and no international body has successfully held Israel accountable for the abduction. The precedent set by the Darwish capture has implications for how intelligence services around the world think about extraterritorial operations and the limits of acceptable action in pursuing national security objectives.
For Hassan Darwish personally, the operation represented the end of a career in Hezbollah's logistics operations and the beginning of what will likely be a lifetime in Israeli custody. He has occasionally been mentioned as a potential candidate for prisoner exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah, but as of December 2025, no such exchange has occurred. He remains in an Israeli prison, one of several thousand security prisoners held by Israel on terrorism-related charges. His family in Lebanon has had no contact with him since his disappearance in September 2003.
Hezbollah replaced him in its organizational structure within months of his capture, and the weapons procurement networks he helped manage continued operating with only temporary disruption. From a strategic perspective, the operation's long-term impact on Hezbollah's capabilities was limited. Intelligence gathered during Darwish's interrogation led to some disruption of specific networks and routes, but Hezbollah adapted and developed new systems. The organization learned from the operation, implementing stricter security protocols around personal relationships and foreign travel for key personnel. But the operation did achieve its immediate objective of removing a skilled and experienced commander from the field, and it demonstrated Israeli intelligence's reach and capability in ways that served both operational and psychological purposes. The psychological impact on other Hezbollah operatives should not be underestimated. Knowing that Israeli intelligence was capable of such elaborate operations, capable of creating entire fictional business structures and manipulating personal relationships to achieve their objectives, added a layer of paranoia and caution to everything Hezbollah's operational personnel did. Trust became more difficult, foreign travel became more risky. Every business opportunity, every new relationship, every unusual circumstance became something that required additional scrutiny and verification. In that sense, the operation succeeded not just in capturing one individual, but in making all of Hezbollah's operations more difficult and more expensive to conduct safely. The cruise ship itself, the Mediterranean Star, was eventually sold to a different operator in 2008 and continued working under a different name until it was finally scrapped in 2016. Of the 847 passengers who were aboard during that September 2003 cruise, most never knew that anything unusual had happened beyond a corporate networking event in a beautiful Mediterranean setting. A small number of those passengers, the Mossad operatives and Israeli civilians who had been briefed on aspects of the operation, carried the knowledge of what they'd participated in, bound by secrecy agreements and professional obligations never to discuss the details publicly. The ship's crew, from the captain down to the service staff, remained unaware that their vessel had been used for an intelligence operation. They remembered the September 2003 charter as just another booking, another group of passengers, another cruise in a long career of cruises. The operation's success depended on that ignorance, on the ability to conduct an extraordinary mission while maintaining the appearance of absolute normalcy for everyone not directly involved in the operational elements.
Looking back on the operation more than 20 years later, what stands out is not just the complexity of the planning or the boldness of the execution, but the willingness of Israeli intelligence to invest enormous resources in capturing a single individual. The operation likely cost millions of dollars, involved hundreds of personnel at various levels, required more than a year of preparation, and carried significant risks of discovery at multiple points. That Israel was willing to make this investment reflects the high value they placed on Darwish as a target and their commitment to disrupting Hezbollah's capabilities by any means necessary. The operation also reflects a particular moment in the history of the Israeli-Hezbollah conflict, a period in the early 2000s when both sides were engaged in what amounted to a shadow war conducted through intelligence operations, targeted assassinations, and proxy actions, rather than conventional military confrontation. Israel was trying to degrade Hezbollah's capabilities without triggering a full-scale war, and Hezbollah was trying to maintain and expand its military capacity while avoiding giving Israel a pretext for major military action. Operations like the Darwish capture were part of that strategic calculus, ways of striking at the enemy while maintaining deniability and limiting escalation risks. The human dimension of the story, particularly the impact on Rima Khalil, serves as a reminder that intelligence operations always have costs beyond the immediate tactical or strategic objectives. Rima was collateral damage in an operation that had nothing to do with her personal actions or beliefs. She happened to be in a relationship with someone who was a legitimate intelligence target, and that relationship was exploited by people who saw her not as a person with her own agency and dignity, but as a lever to be manipulated. The fact that she suffered psychological trauma as a result raises questions about the moral responsibilities of intelligence services toward individuals who become unwittingly involved in their operations. There's no clear answer to these questions. Intelligence work by its nature involves deception and manipulation.
targets are rarely captured or eliminated without some collateral impact on innocent parties. The argument that national security sometimes requires morally ambiguous actions is one that intelligence services have made throughout history, and it's an argument that has some merit when weighed against the potential consequences of failing to act against genuine threats. But it's also an argument that can be used to justify almost anything, and finding the appropriate balance between security necessity and moral constraints remains one of the fundamental challenges of intelligence work in democratic societies. The Darwish operation sits at the intersection of these competing considerations.
It was operationally brilliant and strategically justified from Israel's perspective, but it also involved actions that violated international law and caused harm to an innocent individual. Whether one views the operation as laudable or troubling depends largely on where one stands on questions of national security, international law, and the moral responsibilities of states toward individuals who happen to be caught in the machinery of intelligence operations. What cannot be disputed is that the operation achieved its objective. Hassan Darwish was captured, interrogated, prosecuted, and imprisoned. Hezbollah lost a capable commander. Israeli intelligence demonstrated capability and reach that served their broader strategic interests. And somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, a cruise ship continued sailing, carrying passengers who would never know that they had been part of one of the most elaborate intelligence operations of the early 21st century. So let me ask you again, write in the comments what country you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you found this story interesting. These operations shaped the world we live in today, and understanding how they worked helps us understand the broader conflicts and strategies that continue to influence international relations. The story of how Mossad turned a luxury cruise ship into a floating prison for Hassan Darwish is just one example of the lengths intelligence services go to in pursuing their objectives, and it's a story that reveals as much about the nature of modern intelligence work as it does about any individual operation or target.